All right, and so we saved the best for last. This is actually the best student paper. So this is going to be presented by Midul Vipulapati, and he's a fifth-year PhD student at Cornell, where he's advised by Rashid Agarwal, and his research interest integrates operating systems, computer architecture, and networking, and he's going to tell us about understanding the host network. Take it away.
Thank you. Hey everyone, so today I'm going to tell you about some exciting work done in collaboration with folks from Cornell, UIUC, and UW. So our community has studied many different kinds of networks. For example, the internet, mobile networks, and data center networks. This talk is about a different kind of network, the host network. So the host network connects CPUs, peripheral devices like NICs and SSDs, and memory inside a single host. And its goal is to enable data transfers between all of these different devices. In order to do so, the host network integrates multiple different interconnects. So the first is the processor interconnect, which enables CPUs to communicate with each other and issue requests to memory. The second is the peripheral interconnect, which enables peripheral devices to communicate with CPUs and memory. And finally, the memory interconnect, which enables CPUs and peripherals to talk to memory. Now, each of these interconnects has different latency and bandwidth characteristics and runs different protocols. Some example data transfers in the host network are CPU to memory data transfers, which I'm going to refer to as C2M traffic. This traverses the processor and memory interconnects. And peripheral to memory traffic, which I'll refer to as P2M traffic, which traverses the peripheral, processor, and memory interconnects. Now, several recent reports have shown that contention within the host network can significantly impact application performance. So for example, if you have a networked application in a data center, where the host network forms the last mile of the data center network, the end-to-end data transfers between the memory of the sender and the memory of the receiver generate P2M traffic through the NICs on the sender and receiver side. Now, if there are other applications running on the host that are generating C2M traffic, several recent studies show that the resulting contention in the host network can significantly impact the networked applications. This includes, throughput degradation, massive tail latency inflation, and isolation violation. In this talk, so this talk consists of three parts. So first, I'm going to build a deeper understanding of host network contention and its root causes. And here I'll show you that the problem is not just because of resource bottlenecks, but rather due to the poor interplay between these different interconnects in the host network. Second, I'm going to present a new conceptual abstraction to study the host network that captures these interplays and allows us to explain the impact of contention on applications. And finally, I will argue that in contrast to the title of the session, it actually is interesting to study the host network as a standalone network in itself rather than just as the edge of the data center network. So let's get started. So let's go back to this observation from prior work where when we co-locate these P2M apps with C2M apps, the P2M apps observe performance problems. So similar to prior work, I'm going to focus on the receiver side, and I'm going to zoom into this particular problem of throughput degradation. So let's define throughput degradation as the throughput when the application is run in isolation divided by the throughput when it's co-located with the other application. So in this example, the P2M application is observing roughly 1.5x degradation. More precisely, if we plot the throughput degradation as a function of the load on the network in terms of the number of cores on which the C2M app is running, we see that the degradation increases with larger load. So this is the trend that a lot of these prior studies focus on, and the conventional intuition is that these C2M apps are sort of starving the P2M app. Our measurements show that this is not really the full picture. So first of all, it's not just P2M, but the C2M app also significantly suffers. And second, we find that actually in most scenarios, it's actually the P2M app that is antagonizing and starving the C2M app and not the other way around. So to see that this particular graph that I have here is for only one particular combination of reads and writes where both the C2M and P2M are performing writes. If we look at all the possible combinations of reads and writes and look at the corresponding results, we see that in all the other combinations, the C2M throughput degrades, but the P2M throughput does not. So I'm going to call this the blue regime, just to give it a name. And this, in the particular case where both are doing writes, the throughput of both the applications degrades. I'm going to call this the red regime. Now, you might imagine that, it's natural to imagine that these performance degradation problems are happening because of some shared resource becoming a bottleneck in the host network. It turns out that is not necessarily the case. And to see that, let's look at this example data point in this graph where the C2M app throughput is degrading. And let's look at what the resource utilization of resources in the host network is. So in this experiment, first of all, the CPU resources are isolated between the applications. And the two shared interconnects are the processor interconnect and the memory interconnect. And here we observe that both of these interconnects are operating far from saturation in terms of bandwidth. And yet we observe this performance degradation, right? So what this sort of tells us is that this is, host network contention is not just about individual interconnects becoming, a bottleneck, but it's rather has to do with the interplay of all of these interconnects when they, operate together to enable data transfers for different kinds of traffic. Our paper, shows a much deeper characterization with, different processors, different resource ratios, different applications, and so on. Now I'm going to present this, the conceptual idea of domain-by-domain credit-based flow control, which enables us to reason about the performance of data transfers in the host network. So before that, let me give a brief primer on credit-based flow control. So let's say you have a simple single hop network with two nodes connected by a single link. One is the sender, one is the receiver. The sender is assigned credits, which limits the number of in-flight requests that it can maintain. The sender consumes a credit to send a message, and the credit is replenished when the message receipt is acknowledged by the receiver. Now, it's pretty well known that the maximum throughput in such a system is bound by the number of credits divided by the latency, where the latency is the time between the credit allocation and replenishment. Now, you can easily generalize this flow control mechanism for multiple hops. For example, if you have a network with two hops, your first node is the sender and your last node is the receiver. The important thing to note here is that any potential queuing that happens at intermediate nodes between the sender and receiver is going to get accounted for in the latency of this flow control loop. So before we get into flow control in the host network, let me first switch to a more abstract representation of this network. So the endpoints of the network are CPUs, peripheral, and memory. And I'm going to replace the network itself by a bunch of nodes that you can think of as switches or routers that are interconnected by links. Now, the exact identity and functionality of these nodes is not important for this discussion right now, so that's given in the paper, but the important thing is that each of these nodes is a potential queuing point in the host network. So let's dive into the idea of domain-by-domain credit-based flow control. So I'm going to start with an example of P2M writes. So these are write requests coming from the peripheral device. And so here the host network contains multiple subnetworks, which we call domains, each of which performs an independent flow control mechanism. So in this example, there are 3 domains. And basically, within each domain, the first node of the domain is sort of performing flow control with the last node of the domain. And each of these domains has different characteristics. So first, they have different credits because those depend on the size of hardware buffers, which can be very different for different nodes in the host network. And second, they have different latency because they span different subsets of network hops. Finally, the end-to-end throughput of a given type of data transfer is going to be equal to the minimum of the throughput of all of the domains in its data path. So it turns out that depending on the source, that is whether the request comes from CPU or peripheral, and the type, whether it's a read or write, the request is traversing different domains in the host network. So what I showed you just now was for P2M write, and we can look at how the domains look for the other possible combinations of requests. So several of these details of domains were not, and their characteristics are not in the public domain, and we reverse engineered these for the Intel architecture. And I'd like to note here that, give some intuition of, why these things are different. So for example, for reads, you can sort of see that you have these big domains that, go all the way to memory and come back. And the intuition for that is because typically for reads, you have to wait until your request goes to memory and the response comes back. And in the case of writes, that's not the case. Writes can sort of be processed asynchronously, so you have these smaller domains, but it turns out that depending on whether the write comes from CPU or whether it comes from peripheral, based on the semantics of the request, we see these different domains. Cool. So now let me give you some intuition of how we can use the idea of domain-by-domain flow control to explain the regimes that I showed you before. So I'll note here that what I'm about to say is it's going to be very high level. The idea is to just give the intuition. It's by no means precise. Please see the paper for that. So it turns out that the core reason for the behavior in the blue regime is because of asymmetry in the number of credits available to the different domains. And for the red regime, it's because of asymmetry in the latencies of the domains. Let's get into the blue regime first. So let me give you the punchline first. So here, the core reason for what we observe is that when you collocate different kinds of traffic, there is some latency inflation happening due to queuing in the host network. And it turns out that this latency inflation impacts the P2M traffic is able to tolerate this latency inflation without getting impacted in terms of throughput, while the C2M is not. And this is because of difference in the credits for the domains. So to see this, let's look at a concrete example where we collocate C2M read traffic with P2M read traffic. Now, let's look at the domains for C2M read. So here, because each CPU core is able to issue instructions at a very fast rate at sub-nanosecond timescales, the left side domain over here is very high throughput. So it can sustain very high throughput. And on the other hand, it turns out that the domain on the right-hand side, it's incurring a much larger latency. And it also has a relatively small number of credits. And as a result, it ends up being the bottleneck, even when the system is not loaded. And because it's the bottleneck domain, its credits are going to be fully utilized, and any latency inflation for this domain is going to result in throughput degradation. Let's look at what happens for P2M read. Here, we similarly have two domains, but here the left side domain's throughput is limited by the peripheral interconnect bandwidth, or the PCI bandwidth. And it turns out that the domain on the right-hand side, when the system is not loaded, it has enough credits, more than enough credits to actually sustain the PCI bandwidth. And as a result, when the system is not loaded, we see that the domain on the left-hand side is the bottleneck, and the credits for the right side domain are not fully utilized. As a result, if we see latency inflation on the right side, it does not necessarily imply throughput degradation. Now, when we collocate these two different kinds of traffic, we observe queuing, in this particular case, queuing at this node Q4. That results in latency inflation for both the right side domains, but only in throughput degradation for the C2M due to the reasons I mentioned before. Now, let me briefly discuss the causes of this queuing. So there are two causes. The first is your memory interconnect itself could be contended. This typically happens when your memory bandwidth is saturated, resulting in queuing of requests. But more interestingly, it turns out that even when your memory bandwidth is far from saturated, you can actually have contention within memory modules, which can cause queuing. So the paper talks about this in a lot more detail, but to give you some intuition, each memory module internally has multiple banks, and your requests from different senders are basically hashed onto these banks using a static hash function. So you can easily end up in scenarios where you have load imbalance across these banks, which results in inefficiencies that can cause queuing even when there's ample bandwidth. let me quickly go to the red regime. So the observations in the red regime are explained by the fact that there is difference in the latencies of different domains. So let's look at the concrete example here, where we are co-locating C2M write and P2M write. So let's look at the domains for P2M write, which I showed you before. Now this domain in the middle that is highlighted in color, similar to the P2M read case, this has relatively large number of credits. However, in this regime, what we see happens is that it observes like such large latency inflation that these credits get exhausted and it ends up becoming the bottleneck. And the reason for this latency inflation turns out to have to do with the way C2M write domains work. So let's look at the domains for C2M write here. And now I'm going to focus on these two particular domains, which are the most interesting ones here, and hide the others. So notice here that each of these domains is spanning a different number of hops. And this asymmetry basically results in poor interplay between these domains. In particular, let's say you have queuing at Q4. This is not going to impact the latency of either of these domains because Q4 is not an intermediate node in either of these domains. But when your load is sufficiently high and your Q4 queue gets filled up, you have back pressure that leads to queue buildup at Q3. And now this is going to lead to latency inflation for the P2M domain because Q3 is an intermediate node in that domain, but not for the C2M domain, right? So this basically leads to like asymmetric or unfair back pressure for the P2M domain, and intuitively that is what causes the disproportionately high latency inflation that we observe. So this was obviously very high level description. So the paper has much more precise explanations along with quantitative validation. So finally, I want to highlight the point that all of the observations and things that I've told you till now and everything in the paper generalizes even to the case when all of the traffic is contained within a single host. So for example, instead of a networked application, if you have, say, a storage application that is doing reads and writes to a local SSD, we observe the same results and trends. And this basically tells us that the impact of host network contention is broader than the context of networked applications, thus motivating that it's interesting to study the host network as a standalone network. So let me quickly tell you about two other reasons why the host network is becoming more important. So the first is technology trends. So each of the interconnects within the host network is following different technology trends. So processor interconnect bandwidths have always been high, but peripheral bandwidths are starting to grow faster than memory interconnect bandwidths. So, for example, if you look at a server in 2017, the peripheral bandwidth was a small fraction of memory interconnect bandwidth. If you look at a server in 2023, it has for the first time actually crossed the memory interconnect bandwidth, and trends for the future show that this is going to get worse, right? So, different interconnects being on different trends leads to resource imbalances in the host network, and this makes the host network contention worse. And finally, the host network is becoming increasingly complex. So this is because of, different kinds of memory, increasing scale due to, chiplets and multiple sockets, deeper topologies with PCI switches and NVLinks and so on. And essentially, the host is starting to look like a complex distributed system in itself, and that makes it even more interesting to study the underlying network. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Our work leads to, points to several interesting future directions in terms of both building a better understanding of host network, as well as, rethinking the design of systems to better manage and alleviate host network contention. So all of our code and measurement infrastructure is open source on GitHub, and we hope that this will promote future research in this area. Thank you.
All right, time for a couple questions.
Thank you a lot for a great presentation. I'm Bian Liu from Huawei, and I have two questions. One is that what do you think is the fundamental difference between the inter-host network flow control and the intra-host flow control? The second question is that it seems that a lot of problems are caused by the per queue or per priority flow control, header one blocking, right? So which direction in the future do you think, what other technologies can solve this problem? Thanks.
Great question. So for the first question, I think classically when we think about inter-host networks, there are two kinds of flow control mechanisms that come to mind. So the first is end-to-end flow control, like for example, TCP and so on, and then you have hop-by-hop flow control, like in PFC networks and so on. And so I think the thing that I described in the host network is different because you can think of it as a generalization of these two kinds of flow control, like in hop-by-hop flow control, each hop is a single domain, whereas in end-to-end flow control, the entire thing is one big domain, right? So it turns out that in the host network, the flow control is a little bit more nuanced. So you can think of it as a generalization of what we see in inter-host networks. Coming to the second question, I think it's... So here for simplicity, I did abstract out a lot of the details and showed you like single queues. In reality, in the host architecture, we do actually see multiple queues. It's typically for at least for read-write separation. So I think that may be a possible solution that if you could expose multiple queues for different kinds of traffic flows and so on, that might help you achieve better performance isolation. But I also think that's challenging because, hardware resources are very limited and it might be very hard to provide per application buffers at all of these nodes in the host network. So,
Thank you. Do you think...
sorry, we have several other folks.
Okay,
we'll let you come. We'll let you come back. So, KK.
So there is this, the credits that get issued.
Yeah.
It's based on an underlying assumption about the delay or the domain over which that credit is operating.
Yep.
And it's designed basically saying, hey, I'm going from processor to memory, and I'm not looking at anything else.
Exactly, yeah.
And going from the peripheral to memory, that is independent. Is that the one of the underlying sources of the issue that you're seeing here?
Yes, definitely. Like very well put. Yeah.
And it's independent and static.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So it's sort of like they're doing flow control instead of congestion control. Yeah.
Yeah, I think fascinating talk. So one of the things that I think the paper describes is it takes an approach of a memory-centric model where we are, and I'm guessing, I think this can be more generalized to anything else, right? So the C2M and the P2M, right? But the world is changing more towards device-centric model or especially in the world of AI and stuff like that, right? So would this similar analysis and implications apply to, for example, memory to peripheral traffic and then NIC to peripheral traffic? Because that's a model which, as new buses like C2C come along, that's coming more common.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the analysis would become much more complicated because, here we just had two types of traffic, and like you're alluding to now, you would have like, many more different kinds of traffic. And I think that's a very interesting future direction to look at to see how we could extend this to those kinds of scenarios.
I think we can squeeze in one last question.
Thank you. Yeah, hi. So I had a question regarding, do you see these trends holding for different sorts of access patterns from like C2M apps or P2M apps to the memory? Because memory is at the end essentially. So if the access pattern of these apps changes, do you see trends changing or?
Yes, so I think we do see that the trends generalize across like, like random access and sequential access patterns at least, at those two extremes. And I think the reason for that is, for example, if you have the difference between a sequential and random access pattern from memory perspective is basically that, you have better, row locality and things like that in memory, right? So, for example, what we see with random access workloads is that some of these problems get worse because you have like more processing overheads inside the DRAM and you can start seeing queuing even before your bandwidth is bottlenecked.
So C2M C2M apps generally would be better able to do a sequential access as compared to P2M. So do you see that also as a case as to why it would be I feel easier for C2M apps to do like sequential access as compared to.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that's the case, because like, for example, if you look at the applications that we use for the P2M side, like using NICs and SSDs and things like that, those are typically at least the workloads we're running are using like large sized requests and streaming data, so they're still operating at page granularity descriptors and so on. So it's not obvious to me that P2M like one particular kind of traffic would be able to like have better locality than the other. But yeah, happy to discuss more offline.
Okay. Well, thank you for the beautiful talk, and we can pursue the rest of these questions offline. So that's it for the session.